everyone, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we're delighted to be talking to Vishaan Chakrabarti. An architect, urbanist, educator, and author, Vishaan designs and advocates for a sustainable, attainable, and equitable urban future centered on human connectedness. He advances these goals as the founder and creative director of his own global architecture studio, Practice for Architecture and Urbanism, where he leads complex design projects such as Brooklyn's Domino sugar refinery, Philadelphia's Schuylkill Yards, Ford Motor Company's Michigan Central Station project in Detroit's Corktown, major new campus architecture, and a unique urban village in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. After teaching at Columbia University for the last decade, Vishaan will in the summer of 2020 become the William Worcester Dean of the College of Environmental Design at the University of California, Berkeley, the world's leading public school of architecture, landscape architecture, and city planning. He is the author of the highly acclaimed book, A Country of Cities, A Manifesto for an Urban America, and is working on his second book about architecture and human connectedness for Princeton University Press. Chakrabarti also served under Mayor Bloomberg as the Director of Planning for Manhattan in the aftermath of 9/11, successfully collaborating on efforts to save the High Line and rebuild the World Trade Center. Chakrabarti lectures internationally, contributes in articles and op-eds to the New York Times, has appeared on CBS, MSNBC, National Public Radio, and has presented on the main stage of TED. Vishaan, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So please, I don't think you need an introduction, but please tell us about yourself.
Well, I am a lot of the things you mentioned, not really by plan. I came to both architecture and urbanism with lateness and with love, in the sense that, I had an incredibly non-linear upbringing, non-linear career. My parents came here as immigrants with very little money, but they were both academics. We traveled the world with very little money again, but I always fell in love with cities and with buildings and with public space. And I studied art history and photography and engineering and ultimately city planning, and architecture actually came last. And I showed up at Berkeley, where I did my architecture degree, a week before classes started, not convinced I was going to last a week, because I wasn't sure architecture was terribly relevant to the big problems in the world. And then 2 weeks later, I was completely sucked into the world of design, and I never looked back. And ironically, here it is, almost 30 years later, and I'm about to go back to that same college to become the dean. So
amazing.
The world works in funny ways.
Great. And I think, I'm definitely not surprised about you having that nonlinear background, because as we listen to, and I guess no offense to the industry, but as we listen to many architects today, the conversation feels very limited and stagnated almost. Whereas when we listen to you, we sort of really resonate how architecture, design, planning, they can all address all the problems we're talking about, right? We see in the world. If they're really related to a physical accessibility issue or something economic or something social or something psychological, it actually has a huge play. So please, I guess I'm going to start with the very big overarching question of what's wrong with our cities, but we can also touch upon some of the failures we saw of the built environment in the last public crisis that we are, still living, I guess. I guess we're so used to it already. I was going to say, last, but the one that we're living now, which is the pandemic. So, wherever you want to start, but what are you seeing that are sort of the failed attempts of, I guess, planning or building our cities in the 20th century? And then we can go on to what should be doing differently.
Look, it's fairly straightforward. Our built environment's grossly inequitable. That inequity manifests in terms of all sorts of things like gentrification and redlining and a lot of things that have their sources in either systemic racism, if you look across the world, in colonialism. It's about the way the power structure built our world, and architects have by and large been complicit in that system, as have urban planners, by the way. There's just been a tremendous amount of inequity, and what I think it always amazes me how surprised we are when horrible things happen in neighborhoods, when it is an inevitable consequence of the way in which things were done to those neighborhoods. If you tear a highway through a neighborhood in the 1960s and create poverty and childhood asthma and unemployment and all sorts of social dysfunction, that's going to have an after effect 50 years later. Like, things take time to kind of fully come to fruition
Right.
and manifest. And so the fact that I was just talking to someone about the fact that, like, Oakland, California, right next to Berkeley, is still a major hotspot for COVID. Well, gee, why? I mean, Oakland has a history of
Oh,
all sorts of racist policies being enacted against it, right? Urban renewal. That city is still a city filled with essential workers, and so, from medical employees to bus drivers to delivery people. And so of course it's going to be a COVID hotspot. So, the thing is, the inequities we have are actually incredibly predictable based upon the way in which communities have been treated and places and spaces have been designed. And so these things shouldn't be such a surprise for us. This is, 500 years of racist colonial history kind of
yeah.
manifest in our physical environment. It's that simple.
Yeah, yeah. In one of your interviews, you say, which is something that people often need to hear, housing is health, which is, so simple, is so true, and delivers the message right away. Can you
Right.
speak more into that? I don't think there's enough awareness of it, even within public domain, because it's really hard. And I think, like, we think actually so many of the issues, like in within architecture, why real estate is so lagging and behind on every conversation is the sort of, like, how it is so unrelatable to the mass public, and there is really no connection or education into the space you're going to live in. Like, no one's asking, can I get your material passport and see how this building was built when you're moving in? You're
Mhm.
just like, oh, it has like a kitchen and windows. So I think, and this is like all our stat, like everyone's status, either we're not presented with the options, right? We learn to settle, or we're marketed in a way that that's the way to go, but we're really not buying in. And so many people don't even have the option to choose because the affordable housing pool is already determined, and which is causing so many other problems. So can
Right.
you speak a little bit more to the health aspect
Well,
of how housing affects?
I think that is, so housing is health because what we see in most of our cities is that most of the population is rent burdened, especially these
Yeah.
people that we now call essential workers. And, even though I think people have criticized that term, they could say actually it should be expendable workers because of the way they've been
Oh,
treated,
oh my
right?
God.
But I actually think that the term is valuable because it finally kind of brings us back to a moment when we say like the working class in our society has dignity, and that they are essential to the way in which all of society operates.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we really like lean into that term essential worker and say, well, for most essential workers, they are rent burdened, which means that the cost of housing for them is well over a third of their income, right? It's a global sort of metric for whether someone is can afford their housing or not. And so what we know is that the nurses and the delivery workers and the bus drivers that we're all reading about, those folks can't afford housing in the communities that they're serving. So if that's true, why is that a health crisis? It's a health crisis because, first of all, it creates enormous mental and physical stress. Physical stress because it means that they're commuting longer distances to go to their jobs. Mental stress because actually a lot of emotional stress comes from long commutation times, but also just the fact that if you're living paycheck to paycheck, if you have a $400 or $500 emergency in your family, and that means you can't make rent the next month, that's a tremendous amount of emotional stress that's then going to carry over into people's physical well-being over the long term in terms of like how well their bodies are performing and so forth. So there's just this clear nexus between housing and health. And so if we're thinking about that societally, even if we're trying to be kind of more like, kind of bean counter about it, we should be able to say, you know, it's unwise for a society to create that kind of emotional and physical stress on essential workers, because if that starts to break down, it's going to cost society more in the long run than properly housing people, which, you know,
Yeah.
homeless advocates have been saying for decades, that it's actually cheaper to give people permanent housing than to put them in homeless shelters and jails,
Yeah.
right? And so, we know that we're actually spending good money after bad by not properly investing in housing as infrastructure. And that to me is the fundamental thing. We need to think about housing as infrastructure the way we think about subways or water or clean air.
Yeah.
That's a piece of infrastructure. So in my book, I talked about this idea of an infrastructure of opportunity, that we need to invest in those things that create social mobility and social health. And these are not new ideas. I've been reading a tremendous amount about Catherine Bauer, who's kind of a hero of mine, and she was the co-founder of the college I'm about to go be dean in. She was Catherine Bauer,
Amazing.
and it's a mission of mine to make her a much more prominent figure in the world. And she was right on top of this stuff. She helped FDR write the 1937 Housing Act. She talked about the correlations between housing and health.
Hmm.
This country had one of the most significant housing reform movements in the world coming out of the Industrial Revolution, Jacob Riis's photographs of how the other half live, and so forth. And we've just forgotten our own history. And all the way, then bring it all the way to the Reagan Revolution, when by 1986 it is illegal for the government to build public housing. And so we just went full circle in the course of about 50 years. And I think this is a moment when we have the opportunity to kind of revisit that history and think forward. We have to think about it differently, because actually a lot of those housing reform efforts also had racist underpinnings,
Yeah.
and had a lot of like problematic policies having to do with both race and gender, right? But I do think this is a moment to recast the die in
Hmm.
thinking about how we commit to a world of social housing, and thinking about housing as infrastructure and thinking about housing as health.
It's fascinating. Like we often discuss like how architects should get like a separate history education, really, because I think understanding history really allows for the planning for the future. And yet I don't think in any country really, like we also have a studio in Istanbul, and we have an international team, and like all the history education, and I would love to get your opinion on this as an educator. All of it that we're getting is like memorizing dates. I feel like we do not internalize any of the information that is given to us, that why did that happen in the past, like why did it become illegal, or why why they were able to do it in 1937, like the whys and the sort of like the interpretations of different perspectives. We don't do that for historical data. We just take it as data. At this date, this happened. We signed this, and then we moved on to this. And then because we don't have deep understanding of our past, which also happened for the pandemic. There was a pandemic before, right? But not in
Right.
our living memory. So we failed to respond to
We
it.
knew about the Spanish flu as much as people now know, right? Like, I mean, um,
Yeah.
so it's funny. I'm in the middle of reading. Well, I just started reading Race and Modern Architecture, which is a book that's edited by Mabel Wilson, Irene Chang, and others. And Mabel's been a colleague and a friend at Columbia for about a decade, and she's just, I think, just absolutely brilliant. But the insistence in that book is that we have to rethink the way in which we teach the history of architecture and urbanism.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that has to do, well, when you say, well, why are the whys missing? To me, it's because there is this insistence that post the Enlightenment, that the powers that control the world were the good guys, from Thomas Jefferson to Le Corbusier to like we have cast this set of heroes
Yeah.
right, who represented modern enlightened thinking, right? Even if they were slave owners. If you read Corb's statements about the French colonial project in Algeria and Morocco, where he talks about educating the Arab, I mean, Corb was completely into French colonialism. He thought it was great, you know, like, and it's amazing how this stuff isn't just a natural part of the curriculum, but instead, no, we just talk about people as heroes, right? And I think it's all about making a certain set of people, right, who control everything from government to academia, comfortable with themselves. So, for instance, we did this big research, like a big part of what we do in our studios, and like we have another big advocacy project coming out probably the next couple of weeks about streets in New York. And we do periodically, like we just go off without a client and go research something and decide
Yeah.
to just use architectural tools to project questions and ideas about a kind of sensitive topic. So, because I was born in Calcutta, the managing principal of our office was born in New Delhi. We just started talking one day about how little the world seems to know about colonial history.
So
And,
true.
like in this case, colonial history in South Asia. And so, as we, there's like really easy to find research in any library that will tell you that that during the British colonial period in South Asia, 35 million South Asians died. Over 3 trillion pounds of wealth was looted from South Asia. And that unlike what the popular mythology would have you believe about the British building railroads and so forth in South Asia, right? South Asia prior to British arrival, which by the way is almost contemporaneous with the beginning of chattel slavery in North America, right? We're talking about early 1600s. These two things are almost exactly contemporaneous. And when the East India Company first arrives on India's shores, South Asia controls 27% of the world's GDP. They're the world's largest shipbuilders, the world's largest textile manufacturers. We seem to have this idea that colonialism somehow modernized the world. And people just walk around with this history as if it's conventional wisdom and completely understood. And so, what's so interesting is so our idea was there's no museum, no memorial, nothing that's
Right.
any of this. So we started proposing something in the UK about this, and the backlash we got about the idea of having a piece of architecture that would somehow properly represent this history in the UK was just extraordinary. The idea
Wow.
that the British could be responsible for genocide is something that, and that would be manifest in a piece of architecture, was something that no one wanted to talk about because we just live with the myth that, like World War II happened, the Axis powers formed to defeat Hitler, and so the French and the British were all the good guys.
Yeah.
Like they're the good guys. They
Yeah.
couldn't be responsible for these kinds of things. And so, and I think it's very much the same thing with slavery here, that people, there's just this just need to, instead of saying like we're imperfect, right? And that we have this very difficult history, and actually trying to grapple with that history and the fact that that history has direct manifestations today in terms of how COVID is playing out, in terms of how police brutality is playing out, how our streets are designed, how our cities are designed. We just can't do that because we have to pretend we're the good guys.
Yeah.
And I think that's why the why isn't there, because it challenges the narrative too much.
And it's globally like that. Like, I don't know how such thing could be curated as such. Like, I went to, a school like junior high school in Turkey. Same story. Like, US and UK are always the good guys. Like, how does this like global marketing strategy comes into place to make sure that's like Germany teaches about their own history? They don't deny it.
I
They
know.
can't deny it.
I know. No,
It's fascinating.
it's interesting. A very early influence in my life is like, so like I said, my parents would travel a lot. My dad was a scientist and he'd get like, this tiny honorarium and he'd figure out how to stretch it into like us
Yeah.
flying in like the cargo compartment of the airplane to get to wherever. And their idea of a vacation was like in 10 years, when I was 10 years old, we went to Dachau. We went to a concentration camp. Like this was like their idea of like what you should do with your kids during a holiday. But I'm really grateful. And the thing is, Germany is a very imperfect place. Like every place is imperfect, but like they really have grappled with this history.
Yeah.
And look, had they been victorious, maybe they would have written their own history in a completely different way. But I I just think that it's interesting how difficult it is for countries and cultures to do this. Um,
Yeah.
and the way in which that then becomes manifest in the built environment.
Definitely. So, okay, so we don't know our history, or we don't understand, or we stay away from it even if we guess like what's going on. Like it's better to not talk about it because that's not the global message, right? And then there is like the I guess the all the players of how built environment comes about. And there's a lot, like it's a combination of private and public. But within private, it's so hard to see like a company, like even, I'm not going to name names, but even like the big players, right, are like everyone. And I understand it's a for-profit business to do development. I do understand that. But I don't understand how, like, when you sort of talk about like investing in, like, this is like a very common terminology, and it's okay in technology, right? Like, if you don't do the R&D, you're not going to be relevant in the near future. You have to invest in
Right,
that.
right.
But this is such a lacking term or conversation, or even a perception in the world of development. Is like, how do we maximize profit? How do we minimize cost? Which is why like affordable housing, it is what it is today. And then we get all these like standard buildings with standard forms and layouts because that's the most efficient building. And there are so many developers in the world, but it's not more than maybe a handful that really tries to, address local issues, do it really. Like, we can't even be like, we can't say even like we were like carbon neutral. We have to talk about carbon negativity almost, right? Like, we already did what we did. We sort of have to
Right,
fix it from like today and onwards. And
right.
it's such a like, even, and if you go on to like their websites, all of them have a sustainability agenda, right? It's like a marketing message, but genuinely who is doing that, it's not discussed. People who are building accessible buildings, are they really accessible? Just because you have a ramp or an elevator or an accessible bathroom doesn't make it accessible. So all these things, like, why does R&D lack in real estate, and how can the mentality of the developer or the player, like stakeholders, like, how could that change to make this more not equitable, but also like collaborative for a better future?
For 5 years, from roughly 2010 to 2015, um, I actually took on this thing that I never thought I would do. Again, part of the nonlinearity of running the real estate program at GSAP at Columbia, and I, I I I think I agreed to do it very much because of the precise questions that you're asking. Like, because I always felt like real estate was this 800-pound gorilla that no one in architecture and urban planning really wanted to talk about. Like at least back then,
Yeah.
that we all sort of danced around the major force that was responsible for the majority of the built environment, right? And I thought, well, I think maybe it's better to just like, go into the belly of the beast and try to figure out
Mm-hmm.
what's going on, and especially try to influence students. Um, and look, I don't want to cast just a ridiculous generalization. I think
Mm-hmm.
there are some good people who are developers. I think there are good people who are students who are trying to figure out a lot of the questions you're talking about. But I think after doing that for 5 years, what I finally realized is that we can't leave this up to the private sector. It's just not, it's not, the goals are misaligned. Um, Part of where I would kind of cut developers a little slack is that actually some of their major problems in terms of R&D, the specific question you're asking about, is that most developers aren't using their own money. They're borrowing money from
Yeah,
banks and financial institutions to do the development.
true.
Those banks and financial institutions tend to have incredibly conservative criteria for return on investment. And
Mm-hmm.
the returns tend to be looked at usually in about a 7-year window. And so there's very, very little incentive to look at, well, what's the life cycle carbon emission of the building? Or what is that building doing for that community over its life? So there's just this huge misalignment in terms of the way the financial structuring of a deal happens versus what we need, the built environment to do performatively.
Right.
And so I just don't, I think the only way that changes is through government regulation and community control over more things. And also, one of the things that I found really fascinating, again, reading this biography of Catherine Bauer, she, a lot of what influenced her was touring Weimar Germany in the early 1930s. And she saw all the Siedlung, she saw all the housing projects and so forth, was a diehard modernist, wanted to bring modern architecture and modernist planning back to the United States. And it's always tricky with the Weimar because we also have to remember that the Weimar got Hitler elected, right? Right. So like, there's just so much you want to emulate there. But one of the things that she talks about a lot is the fact that private builders, they weren't called developers then, like the private builders built, but the public owned the land, right? And so when the public retains ownership of land, it changes the equation drastically in terms of what they can get the private sector to do. So
Sure.
now fast forward to current day New York, and I'll bring up 3 examples: Battery Park City, Hudson Yards, and Sunnyside Yards. Sunnyside Yard. So Battery Park City, that was land that was built by the public sector, where the public sector retained ownership. And because of that, the public sector still gains a lot of revenue. They build a lot of affordable housing with the money they get from Battery Park City, sometimes in Battery Park City, sometimes in other parts of the city. But it actually has been very accretive for the public sector. Hudson Yards, by contrast, was sold in one lump sum to a developer, right? And so, that land is probably already more valuable than what the public sector sold it for. And so the private will hold that land in perpetuity, and the public sector will now have like very limited control over what can happen there. So our firm did the master plan for Sunnyside Yard in Queens. That's a place where, it's 180 acres. We've at least recommended to the client that land stay in public ownership in perpetuity, because that's how you can enforce these goals of of carbon neutrality or carbon negativity. We've talked about community land trusts, like just completely different development models, because the public sector stays in control of the land.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think we're based in Brooklyn Navy Yard, so I totally understand what you're saying. I'm sure there are many developers approaching where I think there's like 1 million floor area left to be built here. So it's a very attractive area for so many people, I'm sure. But like the Brooklyn Navy Yard Corporation is like actively trying on not losing the manufacturers, trying to create a community here. Like they're very keen on, although it's like, there is like trade-offs, like, it's technically still like a gated community on its own. So how do we balance that? Like some things they're trying to fix, but it didn't become like a high-rise luxury residential like everywhere else became.
But this is what I mean about public ownership. I mean, knowing a little bit about the Navy Yard, I think one of the things that they've done so smartly is they've just vehemently denied the ability to build residential in the Navy Yard, right? Because they knew as soon as they let one residential project in the door, it'd be the end of the Navy Yard, right? And, I believe in mixed use as much as the next person, but like there is the problem we have in our markets is that at least pre-COVID, it'll be interesting to see what happens post-COVID, but pre-COVID, luxury residential had a market force behind it that could eat any other land use, right? And so, you didn't get manufacturing spaces, you didn't get light industry, you didn't get anything else that you might want to create a healthy city because that demand for luxury residential. I, I actually think that what's interesting going forward is that demand is obviously already subsided,
Right.
right? And I think going forward, again, there's an opportunity to recast the way we think about housing, instead of being just this engine of the private market.
Yeah, I really hope the silver lining of this entire lockdown experience that anyone in like on the planet realize what's wrong about their house, right? Like it's sort of like, oh, it would actually be good to have access to green, or it would have nice to have had a terrace, or this room should have been getting sunlight, or this is really not a livable space. This room is too small. Like all of these things I'm hoping, that even not even only the buyer, but the renter will ask for more and demand for more. And I think that is sort of will hold, well, I mean, I guess the top of the triangle is the bank, like financial institutions, and then developers, and then architects, and then that maybe the end user, and also like, engineers, like what is really buildable, what's not really buildable. But sort of that end users more awareness of what is an ideal place to live in would hopefully, push to like upward stream of like some change that is really needed. And I guess you sort of like have a, last part of like what would be the advice. So we often, discuss how architect, and we sort of touch up on it, does not have control of its own medium, right? Like as an architect, you may have many ideologies, you believe in something, and then you rely on the developer if they get the funding from the bank. And even if they do, maybe their budget is already predetermined. So your role sort of becomes like, what can you do within that budget? And then there's the engineers, and some are more progressive, some are more conservative, that can say, oh, you can't build that, you can't build that, or whatever. And then there's, we're not necessarily getting much input from the local community, which should happen more, or like we don't utilize the local networks really. But there's sort of either push or acceptance from the surrounding, right? So technically, we're not like architects are not like artists where we say like, this is my art work, if you accept it, if you don't, it's fine, but this is my art. Architect has to like sort of navigate like entire scenario that is presented to them in order to realize a design. And let's say it's a design that really addresses the issues of that locality, but they really need to advocate for it and push through it somehow within the space. So for anyone who wants to do that, what would be your advice as someone who has seen sort of like all sides of the story and has spoken to people, in all levels of maybe ownership or role in it?
Yeah, I would just say it isn't easy. And it's not for everyone. I think we're a little too glib about like what it means to be an architect in the world today, right? Like this is not an art project.
Mm-hmm.
If people are interested solely in self-expression and nothing else, I firmly recommend going and getting an art degree, and doing sculpture if they're interested in three-dimensionality and light and form and nothing else,
Yeah.
right? And I wish them the best, right? But the thing is, that's not our role. And like part of what I tried to point out in that TED talk is like, everyone, there's this thing about, well, everything's the developer's fault. And like, yeah, there's a lot that is developer's fault. But like part of what I tried to point out in that TED talk was like, there's a lot of stuff just about building code,
Yeah.
right? That even if you had like all the money in the world and the public sector or a community was your client, you couldn't build a lot of the things that we used to build because code simply doesn't allow it. And so there's a lot of factors that come into play in terms of how complex it's become to become an architect. And my response to that is like, tough noogies, then don't become an architect. Like, like if that's not what you want to deal with, right? It is a very challenging thing to practice in today's world. And I think that it's really important that, you sort of started with, well, architects used to have this master builder role, right? And I think rather than bemoaning the past, we have to
Mm-hmm.
look at, well, first of all, how do we, like, I can't stand this architecture thing, but what I'm really interested in is how do architects become thought leaders?
Yeah.
And in order to be thought, because to me, that is how, like, if everyday people and politicians and so forth read newspapers and they read about how architects like bankrupt towns and like, or some of the comments that like Patrick Shoemaker has made and others, like, these things absolutely undermine when people complain or are worried about the stature of the profession in society. That's what they need to look to. That's not just
Right.
developers oppressing architects, it's also architects being their own worst enemy, right? And so
100% agree.
Right? And so, what's the antidote to that? The antidote to that is people who are out there, whether they're scholars or practitioners, who are providing thought leadership that the world finds valuable, that is relevant to the challenges that the world has today. We think spatially, we think about things that we have tools that allow us to synthesize, to visualize, that other professions don't have, that we can use to help promulgate ideas that are useful to people and speaking in language that's understandable to people, right?
Yes.
And like that to me is super interesting. And that's what's going to elevate our profession, right? And I just that which doesn't it's not a lowest common denominator argument I'm making. I'm just saying that you can't complain about being irrelevant and then act irrelevant and expect that those two things aren't going to constantly reinforce each other. It's
Yeah.
that to me is like it's just it's so incredible
Or
to me.
or be in your ivory tower and then say like, oh, why don't people understand me? Well, if you don't try to collaborate,
Yeah, look, I'm a firm believer in the idea that scholars got a scholar, right? Like, if people are PhD researchers and there's a language they need to use amongst each other, I don't think we should try to dumb that down.
yeah,
But there's a big difference between that and people who, in an effort to sound scholarly, are only obfuscating knowledge. That is not the same thing, right? And like particularly the impulse over the last 30 years to slaughter language, uh, to make it completely inaccessible, and to purposely kind of redesign language so that it becomes something that's internal to the field, I think has been so detrimental and so much a part of the way in which people don't feel that we're part of the conversation anymore. And so I don't think I'm alone in this. I think there's a number of us out there that are working to try to reverse that,
hmm
both through our practice work and our academic work, to create things that are accessible, where we can, again, present ideas to the political world, the business world, communities, and
yeah.
say, look, we can use our skills to try to help you address something in a way that maybe you haven't thought about before because of the way we can kind of synthesize and visualize.
Otherwise, how are we different than the financial sector that creates its own language so that it is
Correct.
inaccessible in person, then create like financial crises across the globe?
Correct. And that it's actually the crises of professions, right? I mean, the legal industry does it,
Yeah.
and professions. I think in academia we have the idea of disciplines, and it's important that there's disciplinary knowledge that's shared among disciplines. But I think it's completely different when we're out operating in the world a priori, where we have a fundamental obligation to be accessible to one another,
Yeah.
in some horizontal fashion, not just in the vertical of our discipline.
And we've seen great examples of, whether architectural projects or other type of projects, when there's a true diverse collaboration of not only backgrounds, but disciplines. And that is only possible if we can communicate with one another. If everybody's speaking in their own language, that's not going to be a fruitful project anyway.
That's right. Like when we work, we often work with the engineers and the cost estimators and everyone else at the table from day one. And something that's interesting is that when you were speaking earlier about, well, engineers tell you about like what you can't do,
Yeah.
right? But what I find with the best engineers is like if we're all designers at the table from the first day, it breaks down that tendency to be negative, right?
Hmm.
It kind of encourages people to say, well, yeah, well, what if? Because they're part of the process from the beginning. And you're asking them to design with you, and you're admitting that the design process is not a process associated with one genius individual
Yeah.
wearing a cape, right? And so, like, that to me is absolutely the future in terms of how we work, and I think how clients expect us to work going forward.
I love that. Basically, it's like we should not only think about physical accessibility, but also like communication access, right?
Mhm.
And language access on top of like, diverse and collaborative approach to the profession. So that I genuinely also believe, architects can become thought leaders, and they're, multifaceted skills they have. It could be so useful to so many processes within the city, or even like in other industries. There's a reason why design thinking works in so many industries, right?
Yeah, it's very important. When I started the firm, uh, uh, my son was then 13 and he did the website. Like, I think it was like Helvetica 12 point. And,
Amazing.
and now it looks much fancier, but like one of the things that's still there from the day the firm started was we have this list of what we do and what we don't do, right? And it's like really just like in black and white, this is what we do, this is what we don't do. And it's that list has changed very little. And it's incredibly plain spoken English. And I didn't think it was such a big deal. I thought it was like really straightforward to just tell people that this is like what we're interested in doing and what we're not interested in doing. For some reason, everyone thinks this is absolutely revolutionary. And like a lot of our clients and a lot of our team members really love it. I found out like a lot of my peers in architecture really hate it because there's something that's anathema about saying, well, you won't do something because then you're like, isn't there some way that you can work for Bolsonaro and it'll be okay? No, there's no way you can work for Bolsonaro and it will be okay. That's not like possible, right? Like, it's just
It's amazing. I love that.
sometimes it's like being straightforward is a real advantage in the world. And I think architects could do more of that because it's
Yeah.
just like, again, like the other professions, these are incredibly complex topics. And again, you don't want to dumb it down, but we do have being accessible isn't the same thing as dumbing it down.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, you can be a professor, of physics in college, but also talk to elementary school students about physics, right? That doesn't mean you're dumb or you're dumbing down the profession. You're just creating access.
Right.
This is, a great way to end. I love this advice personally, so I'm sure our audience will also enjoy it. Thank you so much, Vishaan. This was absolutely a treat.
Sure. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for watching this week's episode. If you found value in these conversations, please like our video and hit the subscribe button. Make sure to visit our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz, and subscribe to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts so you never miss an episode. Please leave us a comment or review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You can find our handles in the description below. And don't forget to join us next week.